Hello and welcome to Eye of Gnosis Tarot. My name is Ewan and today we are looking at the Seven of Swords, also known as Futility. Now if you haven't already, I highly recommend going look at the previous videos of the Suit of Swords, and if you have time, the videos I've done on the Suit of Wands and the Suit of Cups, as they'll give much more context to, well, each of and every suit gives context to each other, including especially the numbers. But if you don't have time, and if you don't have time to watch this whole video, I have put a time stamp down below for the Divinatory Interpretations of this card, but as always, I recommend watching this video fully at least once so you understand why those Divinatory Interpretations are what they are, and also so that you can use the tarot for meditative purposes and metaphysical discovery, because the tarot is much more than divination. It can be used to help understand the structure of, well, you, and hence the universe. And with that understanding, of course, we need understanding of the cards, so please do watch the video at least once fully before skipping straight to the Divinatory Interpretations, but they are there if you need them. So without further ado, we're going to look at the Seven of Swords, known as Futility. So we see here an icy blue background, framed by these 6 swords, all penetrating a large central 7th sword. Now we see that each of these sword hilts are decorated with the traditional planets in astrology. And whilst the sigil of the sun decorates the pommel of the central sword, just see it there. We see also that we have Mars, Jupiter, Mercury, Moon, Venus, and I think that's the Moon, that's Saturn, sorry. It's kind of hard to see those two. So yeah, we've got the Moon and we've got Saturn. So the longsword in the centre, we see that it is quite scratched, and in the background we see the pinwheels from the previous card, the Six of Swords, but they've become much larger now, as if they're almost coming towards us. And at the bottom of the card we see the sigil of Aquarius again, as in the previous 2 cards, and we see the sigil of the Moon at the top. So, in the Suit of Swords, peace and harmony are but passing dreams, unfortunately. Passing dreams in the night at that. Once again, the fickleness of thoughts has guided us towards suffering, and now there is no stopping them, and it is pretty much downhill from now on in the Suit of Swords. In Tippereth, the mind achieved its most dignified state so that it could align to its true purpose, which is knowing yourself, essentially. And we saw that in the Six of Swords. However, another thought has now entered the equation, and one that is quite unwelcome. And that thought is doubt. Whenever we achieve something great, whenever we exceed our expectations and those of others, there is always at least one critic. There is always at least one sour voice waiting to sting any wounds we have yet to heal from our ordeal in Geberah, the Five of Swords. Sometimes it is an external critic pointing out real or imagined flaws in our great work. At other times, it is our own insecurity raising its ugly head again, as we saw in the Four of Swords. And thus afterwards, the domain of the inner critic ensues, and we'll see later on in the Nine of Swords what happens if we allow that to continue. Conversely, This inner voice may also become our external voice, and we may soon find ourselves becoming the bitter reviler of others as well. As such, the Seven of Swords is the card of victimizing and victimization. This may at first seem strange in a Sephiroth associated with victory. And this is very much the domain of Netzach, the Sephiroth of 7. Now, the reason why we see futility here is that the mind believes itself to be the victor, yet Netzach is in the realm of Yetzirah, so in the realm of the mind. And this is naught but a delusion. You cannot be victorious in the mind because the mind is an illusion. True victory lies in the will, our energy, our consciousness, which is in the suit of wands, and the balance that we can find in Tiphareth. And this is why the 6 of wands, not the 7 of wands, but the 6 of wands is victory, despite not being in Netzach. But of course, both have been lost here, and we are very far away from that card. The mind also believes another thought will make things greater, yet this is not always so. So just thinking about it too much, essentially. We see here in the 7 of Swords that bias and pride have crept in and spoilt the objectivity that we established in 6. And thus the scientific endeavour is about to be undone. Such a concept can be likened to the scientist who has become too attached to a particular hypothesis, and now their work has become personal. The search for truth has now become a search for their truth, and thus one that is flirting with the paranoia of failure. We have betrayed our virtue and traded harmony for gain, prostituting our thoughts to the ego and tempting our inevitable fall into ruin. And this, of course, is the name of the 10 of Swords. In the 7 of Swords, the ego attempts to ape its creator, which is, of course, consciousness. Yet it is a futile attempt to achieve the valour we see in the 7 of Wands. Whilst the will, our energy, may have persevered through the instability of Netzach, the mind simply cannot, for it is just as unstable as this Sephiroth. The will may drive an idea, yet without love it is futile. The oppression of ego and its multitude of thoughts is too much effort. It's too much for this sword, as it clashes against its peers, and this is what we're seeing here by this central sword and the other swords clashing against it. It's the other thoughts nitpicking at our objectivity. And we see here that the effort of that objectivity has been lost and the momentum has gone. So whether these be the conflicting thoughts of others or those from within us, we have ultimately been betrayed by the mind. If the 7 of Cups, which is known as debauch, and do go look at that video, is too much of a good thing, then the 7 of Swords is too much of a thinking thing. Thoughts have reflected in on themselves, not in an observant, objective or mindful way, but rather a constant deluge of what-ifs and how-abouts. Yet we have not fully destroyed ourselves yet, and whilst the effort may be futile, the mind may still twist some of these questions into answers in the form of paranoia and anxiety. Such fear and suffering soon leads down the slippery road of self-pity and giving in. We have been defeated so many times that we become a slave to the idea that we are the eternal victim. This is the ultimate betrayal of the self, for the mind has now suppressed the will and thus oppressed love. So now we're going to look at the symbolism that we see here in the Seven of Swords. So in the Seven of Swords, we see a lack of trust emerging from a state of harmony. We've become suspicious, paranoid, critical, proud, and unnecessarily skeptical. And we see this, as I've hinted at before, or hinted at earlier, should I say. We see this hinted here in the symbolism of the singular sword and the 6 other swords directed towards it. The single longsword represents the primary thought within the ego, driven by the will, the Ace of Swords, as expressed by the sun, we see at the bottom here, whilst the short swords, represented by the planets here, represent other aspects of the ego and their own opinion on the matter at hand, as expressed by the traditional planetary sigils. Yet this is not a discussion or a debate on the idea. The smaller swords are aimed at the central sword as if waiting to strike. And indeed the scratches that we see on the longsword imply that it has already come under attack. So let us have a look very briefly at each of the sword's hilts, the different signs, and what parts of the mind they represent that are cutting into us. So I think we're going to start with Mercury here. So Mercury is the mind, but also communication. So here it is poor communication is really affecting our objectivity. And with Jupiter, it is the victim mentality and a belief in bad luck, so very much like the opposite of Jupiter. And with Venus, we have the feeling of being unloved and a lack of self-compassion. And in Saturn, we have rigid thinking and a lack of psychological flexibility. In Mars, we have a lack of energy and commitment and conviction. And finally in the Moon, we have essentially not being able to access our intuition via the unconscious. So one phrase that comes to mind when I think about the Seven of Swords is too many cooks spoil the soup. And I suppose we could say here that there are too many cuts blunt the blade. Clarity, conviction, and objectivity begin to decay as countering thoughts scratch away at them one cut at a time. So if we look at the zodiacal placements of this card, we have the moon in Aquarius, and the moon in Aquarius is actually quite a strange position because the moon represents what is hidden, the unconscious, emotions and reflection. Whereas Aquarius really likes to shine a light on the truth, preferring what it can starkly observe, and is adverse to slippery things like emotions. From Aquarius's point of view, the moon has nothing to offer them, and they have nothing to offer the moon. Furthermore, the moon brings out the hidden fear of Aquarius, and that is that the reflection that ultimately reveals them to be essentially fundamentally like everyone else, and that is the worst fear of Aquarius, is to not be unique. Thus, this is a weak placement in a unstable Sephiroth, contrasting with that of Mars in Leo, which we saw in the Seven of Wands, which kept that Sephiroth strong. There is a difficulty here in knowing what we actually want, and when we're this low down on the Tree of Life, this can be potentially disastrous. And just very briefly, of course we see that the pinwheels are still in the background of this card, and they haven't dispersed yet, so there is still the ability to think. But the ability to think does not necessarily equate good thoughts or helpful thoughts. So now let's look at the divinatory interpretations of this card. So in divination, the Seven of Swords is primarily associated with betrayal and victim mentality, as well as uncertainty and unnecessary mental challenges. When ill-dignified... Well, actually, no, let's start with well-dignified. When it's well-dignified, the card represents wisdom through uncertainty, prevailing and unmasking illusions and deceit. But when ill-dignified, the card can represent trickery, bias, betrayal, paranoia, amorality, deceit, self-pity, intrigue, doubt, and criticism. The key concept here is a loss of objectivity, as well as the will within our mental capacity. And this leads to insecurity, doubt, and the instability of thought. So that has been the Seven of Swords. Once again, the Swords cards have become difficult, and they're about to get more difficult as we progress through them, unfortunately. So I hope you've enjoyed what you've seen here today, and if you did like what you saw, do hit a like on the video below, as it really helps the channel. And if you really enjoyed what you saw today and want to see more tarot content, including tarot readings, and I do tutorials on the different tarot spreads, as well as, of course, going through each and every one of the cards, then do subscribe to the channel and hit that bell icon so you don't miss any future videos. So thank you very much for watching, and I hope you are having a wonderful time wherever you are in the world, and may peace be with you all. Goodbye.